Oh, good morning. My name is Valerie Janis. I am the archivist for the Oglala Lakota College. This program is about the Wild West performers, and our project is called They Bring the Stories Back, Connecting Lakota Wild West Performers to Pine Ridge Communities and Histories. This digital project gives names and voices to the Lakota Wild West performers who traveled across the United States and Europe with Buffalo Bill's Wild West and other shows during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There are many photos and objects in archival and museum collections, most without names and other descriptions of the performers. And these Wild West performers are an important part of American history and our Lakota community heritage. And we're trying to ask the community if they have photos, items, or stories of family members that participated in the Wild West shows, and to connect with the archives and share them with the community so that we can keep their legacy alive for future generations. And today we have Dr. Emily Burns, who is the director of the Charles M. Russell Center for the Study of Art of the American West and an associate professor of art history in the School of Visual Arts at the University of Oklahoma. And she wrote the book American West and France. And then we also have Dr. Emily Voelker, who is a historian of 19th century art and the history of photography. And her current book project is Plains Indian Portraiture in Paris. So we're going to start with Emily Voelker. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having us. We're really excited to be here and talk a little bit about this project, which is also related to our own research projects and our own book projects, as you mentioned, Valerie. So as you noted, I'm a photography historian and I work on early photography. And I look a lot at photography and Wild West shows and performance abroad. So not just in the United States, but also in Europe during the early reservation period. So sort of in the 1870s to the end of the 19th century and a little bit beyond. And photography was really a big part of the visual culture and experience of traveling with Wild West shows. So really where Wild West performers went and they were written about and they performed, they were photographed. And so there are huge photographic archives and records all over the world where these performers went. And one thing to really think about with this, which is so interesting, is the same time period as the Wild West shows are really kind of emerging and blowing up and getting really popular is the same time period that the beginnings of photography is really expanding. So photography during this time is a pretty new medium. And by the time you get to the first Wild West shows in the 1880s, this is the time where, for the first time, for instance, you have handheld cameras, you have Kodak cameras where anyone can make pictures. So just alongside these Wild West shows and performers traveling with them, there's this abundance of photography that starts being made. So in my work, I think about why these pictures were made and sort of the context of their creation, their making, and also where they were seen. So who kind of had them and who disseminated them. But a huge part of my research is also about the sitters, the people that appear in these photographs, and particularly the experiences of performers, Lakota performers traveling with Wild West shows during this time period when this is a phenomenon that is just emerging. So that, the beginnings of the reservation period, really. And some of the things that, are so interesting to think about are how these performers are using photographic image making to their own ends, how they want to be seen. So thinking a lot about how performers appear before the camera, how they appear, in groups together, and regalia, right, and posing and interaction with the photographer. And another thing to really think about is the kind of context of celebrity that develops around Wild West shows, and how many of these performers, they really do become international celebrities. They're written about in the newspapers, but again, there's this chance with the new medium of photography to be pictured, to be imaged in a new way. And when these pictures are being made, you know, the sitters often get copies, so the performers often get copies of the photographs. And there's this really famous kind of example that when Sitting Bull travels with one of the earliest tours of the Wild West, he will sell copies of photographs made of him, right? So he'll go around and he'll sell his own photographic images. So the way that Lakota performers are participating in this wider world of representation and cosmopolitanism and thinking about how they want to be seen, right, in this context of celebrity. So another thing that's so interesting about these photographs and photographic archives is what we can learn from a photograph as a, you know, an object from the past, a traveler from the past that we still have in the present, that we can't learn from other types of sources. So when we look at the details of many of these photographs, they're so incredible and they're so rich. I mean, the details like the regalia, right? So what the regalia looks like, and you know, how show costumes were really important, right? It was a really important part of auditions for the show, and then how performers want to look in their pictures. And so there's these incredible details of regalia, but also relationships between the sitters that appear in these pictures, and also the relationship between who is photographed and who is making the pictures. So of course, there's also the dimension of thinking about, you know, the fact that these performers, most of them, right, are ancestors of, you know, Lakotas in the Pine Ridge community, what it's like to see pictures of ancestors, right, you might have heard about during, you know, your life and growing up, but might not seen that many pictures of. So the way they connect us to relationships, right, and the way in which they connect us to the past. So these photographic archives are so incredible. And in my own book project and work, I am working on this large series of about 150 photographs that were made of the Buffalo Bills Wild West performers when they were in Paris in 1889. And of the 150 photographs, almost all of them are of the Lakota performers. And they are in these two albums that are still in Paris, they're still in France. And they are largely single photographs, like portraits of the performers. And we see the performers in a kind of straight on portrait photograph. And then there's a following profile photograph from the side. And all of these pictures on the mounts are annotated with the names of the performers, which is also, you know, as Valerie was mentioning at the beginning, this is sort of unique. This can be special for pictures that were made because sometimes there aren't names attached, right? So the transcriber was at the fair in Paris where they were performing. So they were a native French speaker. And of course, we have the Lakotas who are speaking Lakota, and then we have some English speakers involved with Buffalo Bills Wild West. So it's all these different languages, right? All these different cultures. And there's this transcription of the names. But one thing that I did was I worked over at the OLC archives looking at the genealogy records, and I got help from one of the genealogists at Pine Ridge, Stella Ironcloud, helped me with these genealogical records. And it's amazing because we could find so many of the sitters right there in the Pine Ridge census records from 1890. And so you have the names, but even the census records too, they tell about family patterns, right? Who's in the family. And so you can learn so much from doing this work with photographs, right? And these genealogical records. But then of course, their community context and the kind of community memory around them. So I'm working on this series, and I should say one really interesting thing is that OLC also has copies of many of the prints in these albums. So they're copy prints made later, but they are also on deposit at OLC. So they're kind of an incredible group of objects of many kinds of groups of photographs over at OLC, specifically in KILI, right, at the archives. So along with the portraits in the albums that I mentioned, there are also pictures of the encampment, which was the area next to the arena, next to the showground where the Wild West show performers would live while they were performing with the show. They would live alongside the arena in an encampment. And in these pictures, it's really incredible because you can see how the performers, the Lakotas, lived while they were there traveling with the shows. So you see, the teepees are set up on the grass, and you can see the painting details on some of the teepees. But another really amazing thing I think about these pictures is, although it was mostly men who were recruited to travel with the show, there were also whole families that went and traveled too. And in some of these pictures of the encampment, we see families, we see family interactions. So just to give you one example, in this series of pictures I work on, we see Jimmy Nelson, who was the son of John Y. Nelson, who was an Anglo interpreter, scout, and guide, and Brule Lakota woman named Jenny Yellow Elk Woman, right? So Jimmy Nelson is the son. He's about 13 when he's traveling to Paris. There's also a younger sister he has, Rose Nelson, who appears in a number of pictures from this period. But we see Jimmy Nelson and some of the other little kids who are on this tour, we see them playing around the teepee in some of these pictures, popping in and out and, putting the little kind of baby, looks like to be about 15 months old, in a wagon and sort of scooting the wagon around. So the family interactions, the family life, right, that continues with touring with the show. And it's just incredible to see the details in the pictures. And then I want to just talk a little bit more about one sitter, one performer who appears in the kind of portraits in these albums, and then we can maybe talk a little bit more. Emily Burns, who's here with me today as well. And so the sitter that I'm going to talk about is listed in the sort of inscriptions on the mounts as William or Billy Peyano. He also appears, this name also appears in the newspaper records, and we found it in sort of newspaper articles from the time that were in Paris. And also the census records, the genealogies over at the Oglala Lakota College archives. And I'm talking about this portrait because it's this incredible picture that shows us the sorts of details we can see in a photograph that tell us about experiences that the performers had abroad. So first of all, we see him in two photographs in the album. We see him in one facing the front, so looking directly at the photographer. And then we see him in a second picture faced from the side. And we can see some incredible details of his regalia. So he wears a beaded vest, and the vest is beaded all over. And on the top portion of the vest, there are two eagle thunderbirds. And on the bottom of the vest, which we can see from the side, there's an American flag, which was in a lot of regalia and beadwork, of course, being made at this time. And it's a black and white photograph, right? Because this is before we're having color photographs, so we can't see the colors, but this incredible beauty of the regalia we can see. And as I mentioned, of course, that the regalia is something that is really shown off in auditions for the show and things. And Emily Burns will talk more about the regalia and beadwork. But the other thing we can see in these portraits, and the reason I really wanted to mention it, is he also holds all these souvenirs from the Paris Fair. So we don't just see the regalia he brought with him, right, and was made likely by a female relative in the community for him to travel with. We also see things that he collected while he was in Paris. So one thing that he has is he holds a fan, and it's a souvenir fan that says souvenir from the Eiffel Tower, 1889, which is the year of the fair. And the Eiffel Tower was built specifically for this fair. And what we know from, both the souvenirs that we see in some of these pictures, but also newspaper records, is that a group of Lakotas traveled to the top of the Eiffel Tower twice, two different groups of Lakotas in August of 1889. So they are some of the first people in the world to travel to the top of the Eiffel Tower. And their names are recorded in the newspaper, right, after they make these trips. And we see him in his photograph, he's holding this souvenir fan, and he also has a pendant that he wears on his beaded vest. And the pendant, I looked closely at it and did some research on it, and these pendants you could buy at the 3 different levels of the Eiffel Tower. So there's a first level, and you take an elevator up. And this is sort of the beginnings of when you can take an elevator. So this is also an incredible experience too, right? So you can buy one on the first platform, the second platform, which is like halfway up the tower, and then you can buy one at the very top platform. And he has the one from the very top platform. And when you buy one of these pendants, your name gets inscribed in it. And it's sort of a testament to the fact that you made this trip up to the top of the Eiffel Tower. So he wears this pendant on his vest. It's right under the eagle, Thunderbird on his vest, and he holds the fan. So from these photographs, these details, right, even just looking closely at one photograph, we can think about all of these different experiences, right, of traveling across the Atlantic Ocean to perform, and the regalia that was brought along for these show performances, but then also what happened, right, in these places all over the world, like Paris, the experience of going to the top of the Eiffel Tower. So I think I'll just pause there if Emily Burns has any comments, or Valerie, and we can kind of talk a little bit about some of these issues.
I guess one thing I'd love to talk more about with you, Emily, is this idea that it's not only that the Lakota performers in Paris are there to be spectated, but they are also there as spectators. And so there's this kind of place of looking and experiencing that is really complicated and layered.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the press articles from the ascent up the Eiffel Tower talk about this, right? How visitors are seeing these Wild West performers on the Eiffel Tower, and this is a spectacle, right, to be seen. This is a fascinating spectacle to see, because also these World's Fairs, which was a big venue in which the Buffalo Bills Wild West shows would occur, right, and be staged, were huge international events. There's people from all over the world, and kind of nations are representing themselves from all over the world with pavilions and objects and things. And so it's incredible to think of this truly global event. And in this truly global event, exactly as you say, the Lakota performers are there to be seen. They're there to perform, but they also have these incredible experiences of seeing the world, right? Of being travelers, of being tourists, right? Like, this was one of the biggest experiences of the 1889 fair, was that you would take a trip up the Eiffel Tower. You would not only see it, but you would take a trip up it. Because it's just been built, right? And today it's sort of an international symbol of France and an international symbol of Paris. But at this event, it was brand new. So this, experience that the performers are having all over the world, and I think maybe that's a good kind of transition to some of the themes that Emily Burns will talk about, which are some of the kind of exchanges that happened between performers and people they met, right, when they were performing, especially through objects, right? The kind of way in which some of the regalia that was worn on the shows was sold, right? When performers were abroad. So maybe Emily Burns wants to talk a little bit about that in addition, in relationship.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you all for tuning in this morning about this project.
Yeah, one thing real quickly, sorry. Hi, this is Doug Seefeldt from Clemson University. I'm the co-director with Valerie of the project. I had one last question for Emily Voelker. You mentioned working with Stella Ironcloud on genealogy things and trying to connect census to notations on the object, the photographs. Could you say a little bit about, kind of how successful that is, or some of the challenges you're finding, and some people that have the same name in the same time period, and how difficult that might be, and how important it might be for family information to help move that along?
Yeah, I mean, that's fundamental, right? I mean, the fact that these are pictures from an archive, right, overseas, but that the performers represented in the photographs are, again, ancestors of individuals in the Pine Ridge community today, is that there's so much information, obviously, in the stories, the oral histories that are passed down about the performers, but also looking at the photographs and, right, having seen other photographs of ancestors and being able to make that recognition. So it's right. So the work with Stella and with the genealogies is just part of it. And many of the photographs from this period don't have inscriptions, right? As Valerie mentioned. And so it's incredibly important to have family information. And also there are photographs, of course, that are passed down in families. And one of the biggest ways in which we retain family memory, right, and do family storytelling, I think, is often through photographs, right? Photographic objects or albums. So the way in which the family photographs that we keep and that you all keep in your homes relate to archives, these archives in different institutions, the Smithsonian or abroad, like this particular example, that's so fundamental to a fuller memory of this period. And also, as Doug brings up, identification, because in many cases there aren't inscriptions, and we found a lot of the names in the census records, but there are some we didn't, right? There are some we couldn't find in the census records, or the sort of transcription of the name isn't quite clear enough. And just looking at the photographs with Stella, but also the artist, Arthur Amiotte, and I looked at some of the photographs together when I had presented this material at a conference in 2017, and he just could recognize so many people. He would say, oh yeah, that's so-and-so, and that's the daughter of so-and-so. So the way in which these family relationships, that is a knowledge that's inherent to the community, right? That's passed down into the community, and is fundamental, to what these objects are and mean, right? And I think that's a big part of the goals of this project, is to connect community history, community memory, and stories to the fact that Lakota peoples historically have traveled all over the world, right? And as I said, these pictures are made with the medium of photography, which is exploding at the same time. So I think it's an incredible opportunity to connect the family stories and community memory to a whole range of archives. Yeah.
Just to add to that too, I'm thinking as Emily's talking about Amy Lonetree's work on, Amy Lonetree is a Ho-Chunk scholar at UC Santa Cruz, who has worked with other colleagues to look at early 20th century photographs of her Ho-Chunk relatives. And there's a beautiful book that is co-authored about this called Listening to Our Ancestors. And I think it really speaks to this project's goals as Emily's articulating them, to think about how like personal memory and personal relationship and kinship networks and kind of family legacies and a kind of enfolding of the past into the present is tied to community histories and collective histories.
Yeah, there's some really interesting examples, I think, as you're bringing up, of the way in which archives of a certain photographer, and I believe the photographer that you're talking about is Charles Van Schaik.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's archives of photographers' work, right? Single photographers, or, you know, at the Smithsonian, other places that have these huge photographic archives that when visited by contemporary communities, like the community at Pine Ridge, for example, or you bring up the Ho-Chunk relationship through Amy Lone Tree's work, it is a reconnection with ancestors. It's a reconnection with family, right, and community memory. So I think photography is incredibly powerful in this way because of some of the things I brought up at the beginning, but just, you know, the presence of, you know, a family member or, you know, someone you've heard about there in the photograph, and the incredible things we can see in the details, and how photographs travel in time to us, right, as this sort of way of connecting to the past.
Maybe speaking of time travel, I'll talk briefly about the work of Arthur Amiotte, which is sort of emerging work for me, Emily Burns. I have tended to focus on the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and I'll talk a little bit more about my work on Lakota performers in France in a minute. But thinking about the time travel sparked my wanting to share Arthur Amiotte, the Oglala Lakota artist, has made a series of collages that are really a metaphor for this project and its goals. And in fact, he's generously permitted us to use one of his collages as the postcard that you'll be seeing in the mail, many of you, at some point in the near future. Because he interrogates in his art practice the travels of his great-grandfather, Mato Najin, Standing Bear, who traveled to Paris in 1889 and who was one of the performers who ascended the Eiffel Tower in August that Emily Voelker was speaking about. And in 1999, Arthur Amiotte had a fellowship in Giverny at Monet's house and garden and spent a summer there. And from that period forward, he has produced a series of collages that engage with the histories of Wild West performers traveling abroad. And the collages are these fantastic combinations of photography, of cartoon imagery, of mass culture images of Paris at the end of the 19th century. And he stitches them together in these collages that offer a sort of time and space travel. And the way that I think about these collages is as creating a kind of cosmopolitanism that is specific to this Lakota performance travel, that is a spatial travel across the world, but also a time travel of connecting with the past. So when Arthur went to Giverny, he brought photographs of his relatives with him to use in making his collages. And when I interviewed him in 2018 about this work, and I'm quoting from him directly, he said, "I thought of it as a time machine, me getting together with my relatives again in these places. Only in this case, I was living at Monet's residence." And so there is this kind of drawing of ancestors from the past into the present. And the collages that Amiotte produces play with this kind of mobility. There's one collage in particular that I'm working on that is called When We Performed. And it imagines Monet's house in Giverny as a kind of backdrop. And then Amiotte uses ledger paper to describe the perceptions that he imagines his ancestors had as they were traveling in this space. And then he includes photographs of Wild West performers from 1904 in St. Louis that create a kind of backdrop. And then there is a 1910 automobile, and he replicates drawings from the Kiowa artist Koba driving around in the automobile, as though they are exploring the French landscape. And then in the foreground, there is a kind of geometric space that is abstract, and there is a triangle that emerges out to the base of the composition that is yellow. And Amiotte places a photograph of Matonagin on that yellow triangle. And this is actually based on a postcard from the 1920s of Matonagin at his cabin where he and his wife Louise lived at Pine Ridge in the 1920s. And so there's all of these temporal complexities to the collage that are melded together in this space. But part of the reason that I think this object is so strongly about this temporal flexibility and mobility is because Amiotte also includes lots of sunflowers and lots of pink roses in the collage. And Monet's garden is famous for its flowers, and so that seems like a reference to that. But when I spoke with Arthur in 2018, he also talked about these flowers as being resonant with what he remembered from Pine Ridge. And so it is a kind of connection of place that emerges through these floral relationships. And at the original postcard that Amiotte uses to depict his great-grandfather, where he's at Pine Ridge, there's actually pink roses at the base of his feet. And so for me, those roses are both in Giverny and in Pine Ridge at the same time. And so the collage is a complex evocation of this mobility, of this connection, of this enmeshing between the past and the present through relatives. And it's been really exciting for me to talk with Arthur about his art practice because he is engaging the same individuals whom Emily was speaking about, who I also have studied as part of a book project and article projects about Lakota performers. I actually came to this topic from a sort of oblique direction in that I was writing about US artists in Paris at the end of the 19th century. And I noticed that a lot of white male American artists were playing Indian while they were in Paris, as a way to present themselves as somehow different from French and other European people in Paris. And as I was kind of thinking about what that practice meant, it came to my attention that there were hundreds of Lakota performers who were also performing in international spaces. And so I think that intervention really complicates and contests the idea of who has the authority to define Native American culture broadly and Lakota culture specifically. And so I started to see what I could learn about individual performers and think about how representations of performers in a variety of media, photography, but also painting, sculpture, and also how regalia and beadwork participated in these presentations of identity. I also became really interested in how Lakota performance abroad was connected to the politics of US and Lakota interactions in this time period, especially in 1889, in the contested conversations related to the Sioux Act of 1889 that parceled and carved the Great Sioux Reservation into the smaller components and separated the bands of the Lakota Nation. I was fascinated to learn that while about 100 Lakotas were in Paris performing with the Wild West show, the US ambassador to France, who was Whitelaw Reid, was told to go and ask the Lakotas in Paris to sign this agreement that was being pressed in what then later that year became North and South Dakota, and that the performers in Paris refused to engage the agreement while out of contact with their relatives and community members. And I find this a really important part of this history because it shows that this performance space was also a space of identity, a space of refusal of assimilation, and a sense of kind of challenge and contestation to settler colonial practices. And I think that the other way in which the Wild West show speaks as a complicated challenge to that practice and history is through the art that also circulated with the performance. Emily spoke about the painted teepees that were included in the performances. These were probably painted by community members. And then Emily also mentions the amount of regalia that traveled with the shows. And I think that scholars in the wider conversation about Wild West performers have tended to assume that these objects are essentially props and that they are not communicating Lakota identity or artistic practices. But I would argue really strongly that that's not the case, and that in a period in which people talk about erasure of Lakota culture and suppression of cultural identity, the practice of beading as an intergenerational kinship practice that is produced by women artists in the Lakota community oppose narratives of erasure in really powerful ways. We have a connective tissue to ancestral practices. We also have continuing evolution of beading styles, kinds of forms that are seen in beading in the period that I'm looking at. And so I think that even if the Wild West shows are presenting ideas about the settlement of the West, the beading is actually belying that narrative by showing the continued vibrance of Lakota culture. And so I think the movement of those objects, the wearing of those objects through and presenting through dance and performance enlivens this history. There are some really fascinating archives that I am going to be looking at this year that I want to bring back to this conversation because they speak, hopefully will speak to questions of the continued making and selling of regalia. And these are archives, one related to a shop in Gordon, Nebraska, where a dealer was buying regalia from Lakota women to sell. And often selling to Wild West performers on their way to perform in the shows. Those archives are at the Nebraska Historical Society. And then also in 1893 in Chicago, a man from Mandan, South Dakota, presented a performance on the Midway that included selling regalia in 1893. And there are some lists of the objects that are kind of circulating and being sold. And so I think the history of beadwork and the circulation of that beadwork is an understudied part of Wild West performance that I'm really excited to chart through. In my project, there are a couple of beaded tunics and pants that were sold from the Wild West shows into French collectors. One French artist named Rosa Bonheur became really fascinated with the Wild West show, and she made paintings of Inyan Matau, Rocky Bear, wearing regalia that she ends up having in her own collection. And this regalia appears in almost every photograph and newspaper print image of Inyan Matau in Paris in 1889. And it has triangular pant legs or beading on the pant legs with square cross symbols on the legs. And then the shirt is a stunning tunic, which is painted with blue on the top, and then it fades into a yellow at the bottom. And then there is striking red, white, and blue beading across the shoulders and back. There is a thunderbird across the back of the tunic, the yoke of the tunic as well. And there are eagle feathers on the arms. It is a stunning piece of regalia that probably precedes the Wild West show. It's more akin to the warrior shirts that were made in the 1860s and 1870s. And this regalia is still in Rosa Bonheur's collection. And it's in like her studio outside of Paris. And it has really fine beadwork, line stitching that it really like almost like seems to vibrate as you look at it, as the beads are kind of pressing up against each other. And I think that I'm also really excited to think about objects like this, not only as they're communicating Lakota identity for performers as they are traveling, but also musing about what happens when that artwork is represented in paintings by artists like Rosa Bonheur, or there are many other artists who were collecting art from Lakotas in the same time period and using those objects in their paintings. And my kind of current work is thinking about wanting to create object biographies that explore more crucially the community making and producing of these objects, as well as the kind of later lives of these objects, in which their representations in other media and outside of Lakota contexts are a kind of stopgap in the larger history of these objects. Because as with the photographs that Emily Voelker is looking at, I think that the regalia is also a piece of connective tissue with both the past of making and continued making. There is a collection from 1935 of regalia that was sold and is now in a Brussels gallery. These objects are reproduced in a book by Steve Friesen and the collector Francois Claduc, and it's called Lakota Performers in Europe, Their Culture and the Artifacts They Left Behind. I think about that material as, again, centering the making of Lakota women. And there has been a lot of work in kind of current art history that is showing that the field has been kind of biased against what they see as craft and as a kind of anonymized women's practice. And there are many curators and art historians who are now saying, no, this is artwork. For example, there was a show about Native women artists that was organized by the Minneapolis Institute of Art, Hearts of Our People, a couple of years ago. Sherry Farrell-Rosette, Michelle Lavallee, and Kathy Mattis also produced a show recently called Radical Stitch that is about historical and contemporary beading. There is also a Lakota scholar who just finished a dissertation at UCLA this summer, thinking about Lakota relationality and art broadly defined, so visual arts as well as literary practices, as central in community relationships and as both a communication with the past and a connection with present communities as well as future relationships. And I think that all of these projects are really important in helping us think anew about the regalia that traveled in the Wild West contexts. In addition, there is regalia that is tied to Sinte Maza or Irontail, who was a Lakota performer for about 20 years and traveled so much of the world. There are a few war bonnets that are in European collections that are claimed to be his from the Wild West travels abroad. And then there is also a stunning jacket that is either Lakota or Dakota made that is in the collection of the Buffalo Bill Center of the West in the Plains Indian Museum. And it is a jacket with a really bright yellow ochre color, and it too has tremendous line stitching. And on the front of the tunic, there are representations of US flags. And on the back of the jacket, There are multiple representations of horses, as well as horses and riders on the back. And I think that the beadwork in this context is probably evoking the context of the Wild West space. And so there's this relationship between the beaded images and the action that the individual wearing the beaded images is performing at one and the same time. The other thing that's really fascinating about this particular jacket is that there are pencil inscriptions on the inside of it that identify the provenance or the ownership of the jacket after Irontail. And it was clearly passed to multiple other Wild West performers, and not only Lakota performers. A few of the vaqueros and Wild West cowboys are listed on this kind of list of owners. And so we can see this object as a complicated international conversation that is moved through the world through Wild West performance and also traded in international contexts. And so in sum, I think the beadwork is a way to connect with art practices that are important to Lakota culture and society and were historically important, and also to think in really nuanced ways about how the Wild West performers actually expanded and extended the network of that beaded material as they too were moving through space in this cosmopolitan context. Emily and Doug and Val, if you have thoughts or questions, I'm happy to talk further.
Yeah, so one thing I'll note is just this idea of time travel that you brought up. And I think something really important about this type of project is thinking about what archives from the past, right, may be separated from a community, in this case, the Pine Ridge community, right, what they mean in the present and the importance of this reconnection. And we talked a bit about that with photography, this idea of photography as a connective medium, right, or a connective form of image making to the past and to one's family and one's community. Can you talk more about that in relationship to beading, right? And these beaded objects and this beaded regalia from the past and its meaning in the present. And I think that's really something for so many community members to say, but I also would love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. I think it's so, like, in the same way that seeing an image of a family member is this personal experience. I think that having access to regalia from the past is deeply personal, and also to think about it as clothing, as like items that are worn on the body, thinking about performance as what Kiowa scholar Jenny Tonepahut and others have talked about as expressive culture. There is this very intimate relationship between self and community through regalia. And so I think that, again, akin to photography, that relationship is kind of reconnected through that access. And I'm really interested in thinking about how understanding the community histories and the making histories, as much as that knowledge can be recovered or shared, is a way to really center women's art practices and Lakota art really much more broadly. A kind of related project is that there is a US painter who was in Standing Rock and other parts of South Dakota in the 1880s, and he acquired a lot of objects, about 250 objects from the Northern Plains. And he kept note cards about from the list from whom he bought things often. And so What's really exciting about this is that all of this material is in the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. And through the cards, it's possible to reconstitute communities of makers and individuals who used and had these objects. And I think that that can really reveal and engage the important histories of what these objects mean in Lakota contexts, and then kind of what they mean in museums today. And I think too, they push towards a broader conversation about art as a kind of international conversation between US American and Native American worlds. For example, this artist, DeCoss Smith, collected a war bonnet from Hunkpapa Lakota individual named Rain in the Face, who actually performed in 1893 in Chicago, not in the Wild West context, but in the Wickham site on the Midway. And the painting of the war bonnet by DeCoss Smith was also in Chicago in 1893. And I think a lot about like Ite Imugazu or Rain in the Face looking at this painting of his war bonnet potentially in the World's Fair space. But Rain in the Face was also an artist, and there are some examples of, for instance, teepee liners that he produced that are in the Brooklyn Museum that were collected at the same time by another artist. And so the more we can kind of pull through the archives and think about the history and legacies of beading, I think this is a piece of kind of Wild West performance that is understood, and also a kind of piece of art history that warrants much deeper attention and analysis, and particularly, as I've said, centering the work of women practitioners historically and today.
I thank you guys so much for sharing all of that. I think the work that you guys do with the community helps to give context to a lot of objects and photography. And that's really important to have that context and to know the people that are in there and give, like we've said, voices to the performers. Doug, did you want to add anything?
Just that the project, as you began today talking about what our objectives are, one of the things we're going to do is we're in the process of planning a community scanning event for sometime in the spring. So we encourage people who may think they have material in their own homes or family members, if they'd like to have them digitized and shared as part of this project, to keep listening for when that'll be held. But just to think about these important connections to your family history that exist in these objects, these whether they're photographs or letters or clothing or other regalia, that they speak not just to your own family history, but they help tell a larger story of Lakota community history, of Western American history, and of course just American history in general. As you know, when these Lakota folks traveled with Buffalo Bill and other Wild West shows throughout Europe, Cody had over 3,000 performances, in the U.S. and Europe. They impacted a lot of people. They demonstrated their culture. Sometimes it was stereotyped. Sometimes it was, more authentic, like Emily Voelker talked about in the camps. The people, when they bought a ticket to the Wild West show, they walked through there and they got to see and meet, in some cases, some of the families and other performers near their lodging. And we have newspaper accounts we found from England and other countries where people met Native people in the streets after the shows, and so there's all kinds of this kind of cultural communication that happened as part of what was an entertainment venture. But they also came back. They came back to most of them. There are some who stayed in Europe, who married people, and there are some who died during the performances, not during the performances, but during the tours, and are buried in places in Europe. But most of them all came back to the community, and they told those stories of their adventures and who they met. And I think that's something that often is lost in the official record. And this project that's grant funded by the National Archives realizes that, and they want us to work with the community to find the appropriate way to tell a community history from the Lakota perspective. And so this will be a digital project that everyone will be able to access for free. And it'd be great to add listeners' family materials to that collection eventually, Val.
Just to jump into, Emily and I are actually joining you today from Rapid City. We've just arrived last night, and we'll be here in the area for the next several days. And we will be this afternoon at Woksape Tipi. And if you happen to be available and are interested to talk with us more about the project, please feel free to just drop in. We should be there from about 1 o'clock today or so. Also, feel free to send us an email online. Both of our email addresses are online. And I think we can also give the number for the OLC library if you'd like to call in, and then you can also schedule a time to see me and Emily, or both Emilys, over the next few days. And then we're hoping to come back multiple times over the course of this project. So we're really excited to meet and talk about these histories. Val, is there a phone number that we can give?
Yes, so the Oglala Lakota College Woksape Tipi Library and Archives, the number you can call is 605-455-6065. You can also email me at vjanis@olc.edu if you have questions and you can't remember the number. And like they said, they'll be here today. You guys can always call and even talk about how you want to share your photos and items. So we look forward to hearing from the community.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share our work.
Yeah, thank you. This was really incredible opportunity. And I think just listening to everyone speak, thinking about how a community-centered history relates to this, larger global story. That's really incredible to tell and important to tell.
Yeah, and we just want to say thank you to both Emilys for joining us today and talking about your projects. And the books really help community members to see photos that they might not see. And so that's really beneficial to the community itself.
Right. And if you enjoyed this, we have 2 more Thursday shows next week and the week after, the 14th and the 21st. And we have other guests scheduled to join us, and it may be hosted again by Amanda and Cecilia. I'm not sure, or you'll hear from Valerie and I again. But we're really excited to share this with you, the greater listening audience of KILI Radio.
All right. Well, you guys all have a wonderful day, and thank you for joining us.